este ciclo de conferencias de 2 días, la esfera civil y las tendencias autoritarias en las democracias. Es un gusto para mí presentar al doctor Carlo Tognato, quien es fellow en un centro, el Centro de Sociología Cultural de la Universidad de Yale, y quien nos presenta hoy una muy interesante ponencia titulada, un momentito, where is it? On denouncing double standards in civil play. Carlo, muchas gracias. Un gusto nuevamente tenerte en Flaxo. Tienes unos 25-30 minutos para tu ponencia. Gracias a todas.
Gracias, Ligia.
Y todos.
Gracias, Ligia, y gracias a Nelson y a todos los colegas, Liliana, Santiago. Regreso acá en Flaxo siempre con grandísimo placer. He tenido unos estudiantes magníficos, Jimena, Juan Camilo, ¿dónde está? Bueno, entonces estoy muy contento de estar de regreso, no solo a América Latina, a México y a Flaxo en particular. Bueno, lo que vamos a hacer hoy, sorry, English. I was convinced I was speaking in English. Sorry, Jeff. We will start to talk a little bit about CST, civil translation, and the issue of double standards in civil translation. And then I will try to refer to the issue of double standards in civil translation in relation to the protests over the Black Lives Matter movement. And then I will try to tease out some of the broader theoretical issues and the relevance of shedding light or focusing on the issue of double standards in civil translation for the study of populism. And I would just say a few things about what the paper does, what it does not, and also what I came short of doing because I simply hadn't enough time to add more things in space. All right. Democratic commitments feed from the everyday meaning-making practices by which people weave the civil fabric of society and constantly rehearse civil principles in their everyday interactions. Civil sphere scholars have made such meaning-making practices the focus of their analysis and have shown that civil translation is a central functional mechanism in civil play by which people weave the fabric of civil solidarity that binds them together. As Alexandra explained, and here is the gist of civil translation, they do so by bestowing the attributes of the civil upon their motives and their particularistic causes, so as to elicit solidarity on the part of others, and by attaching anti-civil attributes onto their adversaries in an effort at polluting them and ultimately undermining societal support for them. So this is what ultimately civil translation is about. As the horizon of civil solidarity and inclusion constantly shifts back and forth like an accordion in everyday civil interactions, as a result of such a symbolic process of attribution and demarcation, civil actors constantly evaluate whether those civil attributions make sense and whether those who engage in them exhibit a credible commitment to civil ideals. Ascertaining the good faith of civil player, though, is a tricky task. Participants in civil life often go about assessing the good faith credentials of others in civil play by checking whether, for example, the latter engage in practices of double standards in civil translation. And when they think that they have found evidence of those double standards, they seek to denounce them with an eye to polluting those who engage in double standards. When such accusations stick, which is a big ask anyway, a shadow of doubt is cast over the civil credentials of those civil players, and that ends up undermining their future attempts at civil translation. They lose their civil credibility. The loss of trust in their capability and willingness to engage in civil play, though, may also convince those who reach such conclusion that they should no longer engage in civil play with them. Thus, when civil translation is applied with double standards, there is always a chance that it may no longer contribute to uphold civil play, as it is functionally supposed to do. Instead, it may switch people away from civil play. The ambiguity of the effects on civil life of levying the accusation of double standards in civil attributions also appears to surface in the literature about political hypocrisy, of which the use of double standards in civil translation provides an example. Scholars working on this topic have noted that charges of hypocrisy may help liberal democracies, and here I quote, maintain some standards of decency, or another quote, reassert the norm of public spiritedness, or another quote, reaffirm the importance of civic virtue. And yet, in deeply divided societies, accusation of political hypocrisy, and thus of double standards in civil translation, so some may have suggested that the accusations of political hypocrisy under such circumstances of deep political divisions and social divisions may still perform an important function. That is, they are not so much geared to persuade adversaries that they are breaching civil expectations, but rather they are geared to reaffirm the civil commitments of their critics, even in the face of such breaches. As Michelle Obama used to say during the 2016 presidential election in the US, when they go low, we go high. When that happens, then denouncing double standards in civil translation may indeed serve the purpose of reaffirming the endurance of civil play. However, we must also allow for the scenario in which people on the ground might take it instead as a signal to jump ship and leave civil play altogether. If those are using double standards, it's not worth to play with them. Let's get out of civil play altogether. When this occurs, then the civil sphere undergoes a process of degradation as a result of the civil function of civil translation being switched off, or if you will, hollowed out. Today, I will try to bring this possibility into our horizon of vision within the context of the protests over the murder of George Floyd in 2020 by Minneapolis police, and will then try to tease out its broader theoretical significance. In response to the murder of George Floyd, a large wave of public demonstrations in 2020 took the streets for more than 2,500 cities in America. And for the first time, a coalition of supporters for the Black Lives Matter movement came together in the US that cut across race, gender, and with ample support on the part of white Americans. Such breadth of participation transmitted the fact that the BLM movement was quite successful at generalizing its plight for solidarity across American society, by insistently representing its struggle in civil terms within the American public sphere, and by polluting its adversaries and their practices in anti-civil terms. This is apparent in the debate over violence in the BLM demonstrations. Only 3.7% of the protests involved property damage and vandalism. However, people still debated whether the protests could still be labeled as peaceful and thus legitimate. Those who thought they were not legitimate and were not peaceful because of that 3.7% underscored the unreasonableness of such representation and its as peaceful and its manipulative streak, and noted, and here I quote, that the narrative building burn at peaceful protest is Orwellian doublethink in action. On the opposite side, observers called out the bad faith and hypocrisy of those who failed to differentiate between peaceful and violent protesters. By targeting the protests as such, for example, critics were undermining the very protection of the First Amendment rights, which constitute a fundamental pillar of the rule of law that they claim to uphold. critics called the looting and vandalism out for their illegality and immorality, and so to strip them of any civil attributes that might be bestowed upon them by certain BLM supporters. However, on the BLM side, some observers underscored the bad faith and manipulation by which the media addressed the phenomenon of looting in relation to the black and white communities. And here I quote, "Looter often means black, as we saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, when a photograph of a white couple finding necessities from a grocery store was compared with one of a black man whose search for similar items was deemed as looting." End of quote. While distancing themselves from violent protests, other observers acknowledged the civil character of violent protesters by recognizing the rationality of their acts and by refusing to accept that they acted out of irrational animalistic passions, which would be anti-civil. And here I quote, "Given the racial dimension of these protests, even apparently sympathetic explanations of theft and destruction risk of implying that people of color are reacting from feelings rather than carrying out reasoned, calculated acts with their own perfectly legitimate political logics," said one observer. To sum up, supporters and opponents of the BLM protests repeatedly tapped into a broad variety of civil attributes to make their points, including rationality and irrationality, reasonableness versus passion and excitability, truthfulness and criticism versus deception and manipulation, rule of law, equality, and equality versus arbitrariness, power orientation, hierarchy, adscription, and exclusion. As members of a civil community, engage in civil play, they are constantly seeking to translate their actions in civil terms and exhibit their own civil commitments before their audiences, while the latter are constantly on the lookout to ascertain the authenticity of those commitments and the persuasiveness of those translations. In particular, audiences will use any evidence of double standards in translation as a way to cast doubt about the genuine commitment on the part of certain players to civil norms. And here we have an example. Trevor Noah, the famous South African comedian that is very famous in the United States, commented along these lines on the coverage that Fox News gave of the Capitol Hill riot. And here I quote, I get it now. These people weren't creepy bloggers. They were solid, law-abiding Americans, the ones that assaulted the Capitol Hill in January 6th. And nobody is allowed to kill cops except for the people who respect cops. They can do whatever they want. And then Noah concluded, look, man, the point is you guys clearly don't care about cops. You only care about the idea of using cops to keep black people in their place, end of quote. On a different occasion, during the BLM protests, Fox News opinion hosts were adamant to condemn the violence and did little not only to differentiate between peaceful and violent protesters, but also to understand violence and discuss its context. For example, according to Tucker Carlson, and here I quote, the indiscriminate use of violence by mobs is a threat to every American of all colors and backgrounds and political beliefs. Democracy cannot exist when people are rioting. Rioting is a form of tyranny. The strong and the violent oppress the weak and the unarmed. It is oppression, end of quote. However, with regard to the MAGA rioters assaulting Capitol Hill on January 6, 2021, Fox News opinion hosts were far more open-minded and understanding and called for some necessary differentiation as well as some forms of empathic understanding of the social context from which the event emerged. Carlson, for example, showed a sympathy with those deeply frustrated Trump supporters who participated in the siege on the Capitol he said, millions of Americans sincerely believe the last election was fake. And beside, the assailants were kind of solid Americans. Then he paused on the death of the white woman who was shot and killed by police during the assault of the Capitol building, and he said, it's not enough to call it a tragedy. Imagine for a second that Babbitt was your daughter. If you don't bother to pause and learn a single thing, you are a fool. Clearly, the terms were very different from the terms he used to talk, for example, about the guy who was in Wisconsin who pulled out an AR-15 and killed, the BLM demonstrators. The systematic and repeated application of double standards in civil translation over a long period of time has enabled some observers to depict Fox as if it had completely opted out of civil play. Some, for example, accused it of being, and here I quote, a hazard to our democracy, and others said that even a threat to national security. And another quote says, Fox News is prepared to destroy the Americans' democratic tradition if it will help its most important and most dedicated daily viewer. In an interview to the CNN, in turn, a former neo-Nazi even compared Fox to hate radio from the Rwandan Civil War. And a contributor to The Atlantic noted, and here I quote, if America descends into civil war, at least we'll know what channel was on when it began. To sum up, civil discourse is commonly deployed in our societies to generalize solidarity across them. Civil translation, though, may be deployed in an asymmetric fashion across a social space by players that may apply double standards in their practices of civil attribution. Where civil life is robust and vibrant, we would expect that practices of double standards in civil translation would not be systematic. When they do become more systematic, though, denouncing double standards in civil translation may no longer work as an anchor that keeps people within the orbit of civil play. Instead, it may be used by them as a sign, as a call, that it is time to jump ship to non-civil forms of play and to a different structure of feeling, thereby catapulting society along the path of civil degradation. Future research will need to shed more light on when and how denouncing civil standards in civil translation switches people off or on civil play. We may ask at this point why it is theoretically relevant to recognize the functional switch that may apply to civil translation as people levy charges of double standards, and how that may speak to the reality of certain forms of populism. So far, civil theory has recognized an important type of change, that is, the one that ensues from the performative struggles over civil attributions that members of a civil community engage in. In other words, they focused on change resulting from the push and pull of forces in civil struggles. And thus, they have seen change as a product of the stretching and contracting of the civil sphere and of its horizon of civil solidarity as if it were like an accordion. We are not entertained so far in civil theory, though, that while hearing the accordion playing, some people might get the signal that it is time to drop the accordion and go for some other instrument. By zooming into the way civil translation is deployed, we might have a chance, perhaps, to ascertain the performative circumstances under which people may decide to opt out the civil play in response to witnessing the practice of double standards in civil translation. In my paper, I don't dwell on it. I don't give you any elements to show how performance steers one way or the other. I just put it as a conjecture that civil translation can actually sometimes work against its function to preserve the civil order. Biologists recognize that functional changes in organisms may result into the alteration of those very organisms. Cancer viruses, for example, are notorious for hijacking the physiological functions of their hosts. They twist them, make them work for them, and in the end, they alter their hosts often in pernicious ways. Cultural anthropologists have also recognized this type of changes, the changes that result from the change of function, while structures maintain themselves in a stable way. They're all the same. When Marshall Salins studied the encounter between Captain Cook's sailors and the Hawaiian natives, he noted that native women from the lower echelons of Hawaiian society approached the sailors, exchanged with them their sexual favors, and received gifts in return. Salins adds that a taboo in a Hawaiian society forbade elites from approaching foreigners, and that thus, within the context of that cultural encounter, the taboo, which was functionally meant to keep those elites on top of the social pyramid, under those circumstances was now working against them, and favored those lower status women instead. Those women, in fact, under those specific circumstances, could acquire new riches and rise in status within their own society as a result of that. So the twisting of the function of that taboo allowed to produce change. So what I'm saying here is that there might be a possibility of twisting of the function of civil translation that might work against the civil order instead of towards reaffirming it. Salins concludes that such an extraordinary situation or cultural encounter managed to twist the function of the taboo. Today, I focused on essential functional mechanisms of the civil sphere, that is, civil translation, to put forward just a conjecture that a changing context in which civil translation is deployed might actually twist it in ways that might switch people off civil play instead of reaffirming their commitment to civil ideals and civil play, as the civil translation commonly does. Whoever has lived in societies where destructive forms of populism have debilitated civil life might have come to suspect that the change in the civil sphere that they might have witnessed may have not only ensued because the accordion of the civil sphere was stretched and shrunk in new ways by those populists, but also because those populists managed to find a way to progressively modify the accordion, modify the functional mechanisms of the civil sphere, and turn it into a different instrument. Destructive forms of populism may change the physiology of civil life by altering one of its fundamental functional mechanisms, i.e. civil translation, and hijack its function. Thus, it does no longer work to affirm civil play, but rather to get people to drop out of it. And so when I think of Jeff's graph in his first chapter of that beautiful book that they edited with Peter and Giuseppe Shortino, my sense is that within this circle, you have forms of populism that expand and stretch the accordion, but keep the accordion. Whereas outside, you might have forms of populism that are messing with the functional mechanisms of the civil order, and then perhaps prompting people to get out of civil play. Again, I'm not showing this in the paper. I fall short of it. My bad. My last considerations, and here I close, will spell out what this presentation sought to achieve and what it does not and could not. I'm not saying that there is a definitive exogenous test for good faith in civil translation. I'm only open to register the possibility that people on the ground may denounce double standards in civil translation with the expectation or with that expectation or that hope that by showing double standards, they can show bad faith in others. Although, in deeply divided societies, I'm pessimistic that those charges will stick because people will just know already what to believe. Seeing that they continue to do so under such circumstances, though, I've asked why they continue to denounce double standards, even if they might think that they don't stick. I've put out the conjecture that under such circumstances, levying the charges of double standard in civil translation may possibly perform two alternative functions. That is, it may reaffirm civil play, or it may work as an invitation or as a signal to people to jump ship and opt out of civil play altogether. How such functional switch operates and thus how civil translation takes one route or the other is a matter of performance and needs to be explored case by case, I would guess. That is why, to document how the civil function of civil translation may be switched on and off from its civil function, thereby reaffirming civil play or signaling that civil play is over, at least for some towards others and for some time, we will need a series of in-depth case studies about the culture performance of the civil off switch in civil translation. For example, we will need to explore contexts in which people decide that they will no longer play the civil game and will commit to an alternative structure of feeling based on accusations of double standards in the criminal justice system, or based on accusation of double standards in the application of international law, or based on accusations of double standards in public ethics, or based on accusation of double standards in electoral rules, or based in accusation of double standards in law enforcement. These are just some cases where double standards are normally dictated by people on the ground, but I'm sure you can find many more cases where double standards are being levied as a way either to reaffirm one's own commitment to civil play or to tell people, guys, game off, let's do something else. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al doctor Carlo Tognato por su presentación. Y ahora invitamos a la doctora Maya, está por aquí, quien va a comentar.
Oh, thank you. Yes. No, okay. I prepare just 5 minutes, but it's okay. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Okay, let me read. I'm not going to read fluently. I'm so sorry, but good Monday and the beginning of a democratic cycle. Many thanks to Professor Nelson Arteaga and this Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. It is gratifying to listen to this group of scholars. My respectful greetings to each and every one of you. Today is a great day for Mexico and for the civil life in this country. Of course, the electoral triumph of a front like Morena, headed by the first woman to win the presidency, will be a relevant topic in social studies about the civil sphere, and especially about how it was able to fight a battle turning around the double standards that were not so much in the traditional media, but in the fast social networks like later Twitter, old Twitter, and in the open debate spaces accessible through YouTube and other digital platforms. As we listened to Professor Tognato, his reflection today is an analytical weaving between the three components of civil sphere in motion, namely, first, the competition between actors, actresses, and meaning-making practices, civil and democratic. Second, the so-called civil translation by Jeffrey Alexander, understood as mechanism through which senses of solidarity and communality are woven, while attributing anti-civil threats in adversarial agents. And third, the growing participation of a double standards by the media, journalists, voices of civil society that use exactly the same use of means of protest, social mobilization as valid and understandable in some actors and actresses, but totally invalid and morally low, violent and destructive in other actors and actresses. The most perverse example happened in the United States during the pandemic, and the biggest social protest of recent times, Black Lives Matter, after the murder of George Floyd by a cold white policeman in Minneapolis in 2020. All of us have testified the racist conflict involved in. Nowadays, we are involved in more conflictive societies. Tognato's conclusion is paradoxical when he says in his first conjecture is, quote, that denouncing the double standard could function as a commitment device for those who do so, denying them of the mass of civil commitment and preventing them from yielding to the temptation to abandon the civil game and follow the sirens of an alternative. Illiberal structure of feeling, which is a famous concept from Raymond Williams, you know, whoever. Illiberal structure of feeling, along with the adversaries, they set out the denounce. If this occurs, then the denunciation of double standards in civil translation could conceivably serve to restrain the centrifugal forces in society that work to undo the civil order. However, Professor Tognato says, there is also the possibility that when the denunciation of double standards in civil translation intensifies and becomes much more endemic throughout society, this could function as a call to abandon ship and thus could signal that society is in the midst of a process of accelerated transition away from the civil order. End quote. In the line of problematization followed by Tognato, identifying the context that could twist the mechanism of civil translation is such a way as to alter the functioning of the civil sphere itself and lead to its change in terms of a negative populism, for example. This may provide a way to observe the type of change that takes place along a process of civil degradation. Okay, taking this background of your reflection, my comments are more like questions. For example, don't you think, Professor Tognato, that the cultural exchange taken from case studies such as Captain Cook's encounter of sailors and native Hawaiians, which Marshall challenged took into account to observe the role of nothing women's sexual exchange that broke elites' taboo to avoid a contact with the foreign and with women of inferior status, not only triggered a change in Hawaiian society, but transformed it in a very profound, in a very dramatic way from start to finish. So, with it no more interesting to pursue a different kind of analysis of changes in the civil sphere than that of the contamination of social solidarity? I'm sorry if I don't understood, but the heart of challenge, yes, is the problem of how collective identities are mixing. Yes, of course. But right now, this is not the problem, exactly the problem from the civil society point of view. I think so, I'm sorry. Second, though we are more implicated in another kinds of problems that are turning out civil life, for example, a contemporary turn towards modes of existence in plural worlds, bless you, where the problems of how to live concern everyone. The so-called ontological turn places social thought at the threshold of thinking about the living, multi-species, but also implies a multi-directional traffic between the social and the inorganic, the non-human and the geological issues. Only beyond the mid-20th century is there clear evidence for fundamental shifts in the state and functioning of Earth system that are beyond the range of variability of the Holocene and driven by human activities. Humans and their activities are fully part of Earth system. The evidence of the so-called Anthropocene thesis brought to social thought another important one. In order to make sense of the past, we need to go far and deep, and Earth scientists and social thinkers have beginning to converse on that central matter. Taking into account the four axioms of existence that have emerged in recent years, according to the anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli, namely, the entanglement of existence, the unequal distribution of power to affect the local and transversal territories of his entanglement, the multiplicity and collapse of events as a sine qua non condition to political thought, and the racial and colonial history of Western liberal ontologies and epistemology of the West. The entanglement of existence and so on, says Povinelli, is a right and central problem in the whole landscape of social sciences. From above considerations, I tend to include newest set of social action initiatives that are developing surroundings of civil life. Some, as well as shifts in sociological theories that have exposed a cosmomorphic conception of personhood, not just citizen one, as a way to trace juridical innovation of capitalism and the state of safeguard modes of existence in the face of realistic horizon of planetary catastrophe. Okay, the final paragraph of my comments are about a new kind of categories, not just citizens, but, for example, ecological classes, and how these ecological classes are in the heart of civil problems in our contemporary societies. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thanks for your paper, Professor Tognato. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a la doctora Maya Aguiluz-Ibargúen. Y me dijeron que en la sesión de la mañana no hubo en este momento preguntas y respuestas, sino que...
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Sino que pasaron a la segunda mesa y las preguntas y respuestas se hicieron al final, la dinámica. Pero pregunto si quieren abrirlo ahora, si hay alguien que quiera comentar, no necesariamente tiene que ser como en la mañana. Ok, go ahead. Bueno, parece que por el momento no hay, entonces un agradecimiento a Carlo y a Maya y pasemos ahora a la segunda ponencia. Del profesor Peter Kivisto, no sé si lo dije bien, del Augustana College en la Universidad de Illinois. ¿Is that at the University of Illinois?
No, it's in Illinois.
Ok, no, entonces es otro Augustana College. Él nos va a presentar la siguiente paper, How to be a Modern Autocrat, or Lessons Learned from Civil Sphere Theory. Muchas gracias, profesor.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very nice to be here. What you're going to discover is that my talk will be more broad stroke than the first three. Can you hear? Need it here? Okay. It will be more broad stroke, and also it's PowerPoint free, but be that as may. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is perhaps the most influential aspiring right-wing autocrat in the world today, his influence extending far beyond his small country. But he alone among his circle of authoritarian-minded politicians might qualify as an academic, if not quite an intellectual. In fact, he studied sociology. He did an MA thesis on the Polish Solidarity movement. There's irony there, I think. He worked as an applied sociologist for the Hungarian government. He studied at Oxford's Pembroke College, thanks to the largesse of the George Soros Foundation. There's irony there too. Okay. Moreover, Gila Teller, sometimes called Orban's sociologist, had a major impact on his thought. Teller was an early exponent of the end of liberalism thesis, his thinking over time veering further and further rightward as he embraced conspiracy theories about liberal elites and foreign agents. In short, if there's any wannabe autocrat that might conceivably have read Jeff Alexander's 700-page The Civil Sphere, it would have been Orban. But I suspect that he's been far too busy to get around to this book. You say, what about someone like Erdogan? Perhaps he's waiting for the Turkish translation. Modi, maybe the Hindi translation. Okay. Bolsonaro, from what I gather about him personality-wise, wouldn't isn't interested in putting in the time and effort. And we need not even speculate about the recently convicted felon Donald Trump, okay? Now, of course, I'm being tongue-in-cheek here. Of course, none of these authoritarian-minded leaders had to be educated about civil society by an elitist liberal professor at Yale University, for they understood intuitively or viscerally that controlling the civil sphere is necessary if one is to succeed in capturing state power and transforming a functioning democracy into an autocratic regime. Unlike many populists who are still aspiring to power, this quintet, I said quartet in my paper, I realized I had 5 people I was talking about. This quintet achieved electoral victory, and they set in motion efforts to undermine fundamental features of democracy. 2 of them engaged in coups when they lost an election, okay? One has succeeded in crushing oppositional mass media and undermining minority rights that are central to any functioning liberal democracy. One in the heated electoral season of 2024 called Muslims, the second largest religious minority in his country, infiltrators, who are thus not seen as fully members of Indian society. He is also widely seen as having had, at a minimum, encouraged violence against Muslims and other minorities over time. In achieving state power, these leaders have served to recast and intensify the debates that have been underway for some time about the future of democracy. Before proceeding, it's necessary to put this into a larger context to understand what exactly I'm going to be focusing on here. It's necessary to understand, first of all, in terms of historical sweep, that as someone like Samuel Huntington argued, democracy sometimes advances in waves. There's a kind of global dimension to it. And similarly, the retreat of democracy, democratic backsliding occurs that way too. We have many descriptions of all of this, most of which are quite accurate, but they do little to understand, to advance our understanding of the dynamics involved of such changes, sort of the why of it all. Capturing the state of democracy globally, in effect a snapshot, has been the challenge of a number of studies done over time by think tanks, such as Freedom House, the Economist Magazine's Democracy Index, and more recently, the VDem Democracy Project. I've been reading The Economist in particular over the last decade, and it's depressing reading. The most recent report for 2023 ranked 167 countries and categorized them along in terms of 4 types: full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, and authoritarian regimes. A majority of countries are not democracies, 93. Of the 74 that are, only 23 qualify as full democracies. And that, by the way, is an uptake from previous several years, but only 23 globally. And I just parenthetically, given our location here, it's worth noting that only 3 of those 23 are in the Western Hemisphere. Not Mexico, not the United States, but Costa Rica, Canada, and Uruguay. Those are the 3. Okay. Now, democracy, as we know, has taken root in some places. It has sometimes flourished over the long haul. In other places, we've seen periods of both democratic and authoritarian rule swinging back and forth. And in some cases, democracy has been lost and has not been revived. In other cases, it's been lost and it's been revived. Okay. Democracies can die in different ways. If Taiwan, which is considered a full democracy, if democracy there dies, it's probably because of an invasion, okay? An external invasion by mainland China. Democracies can be undermined by military coups, and if we follow what's happened in a number of African countries in the last couple of years, you see the ongoing threat that poses. The third way is by democratic erosion from within, and that's what we're looking at here. Democracies wither away internally. This has been the focus, as we all know, of, and I won't go into all, I think all of us have sort of cited some of these books in our papers, but there's a huge body of literature that's been produced over the last few years that has looked at the state of democracy in existing democracies, the challenge posed by authoritarianism, populism, it's called different things by different people. The bottom line message in all of these publications is that democracy is at risk and it cannot be taken for granted, even in a country like the United States, which claims to be the oldest democracy. But there's also a sense in most of these publications that the culture of democracy can be resuscitated and a liberal democratic order can be restored. Many of the same authors that have rung the alarm bells have also written prescriptions for curing ailing democracies. In short, they want to project a sense of foreboding, but they don't want to tell us that the apocalypse is upon us. However insightful these many, many publications have been, and I've learned a lot from them, they have addressed, some of them have been grounded theoretically too, so they've been helpful in terms of advancing understanding, but what they all lack is a macro-theoretical framework that can provide the basis for a broader, more comprehensive analysis of the state of democracy. Agreeing with the maxim attributed to the social psychologist Kurt Lewin that there is nothing as practical as a good theory, I want to turn to civil sphere theory as a source of a practical framework for understanding how democracy withers from within. Okay? The book, in a nutshell, argues that for democracy to be possible, two things are essential. A culture of democracy encapsulated in a discourse structured by a binary code operating at three levels: motives, relations, and institutions. And secondly, a complex of social institutions that can be divided between communicative and regulatory. A democratic culture and the social structures necessary to sustain its development historically always begin with an exclusionary view of who merits being a citizen. Thus, at its founding, the only people deemed fit for American citizenship were white, male property owners. Okay? While the US, like other liberal democracies over time, and as a consequence of social movement struggles, succeeded in expanding the boundaries of citizenship to include women, the working class, and racial minorities, civil sphere theory balks at the idea of seeing these developments in evolutionary terms, with the implication being that such democratic achievements cannot be undone. Okay? At the discursive level, opponents work the binaries, and you heard some of this in the other papers, in an effort to define themselves and their political positions in a democratic light, while arguing that their opponents are uncivil, failing to live up to democratic expectations. This is the world of both normal and pathological politics. The difference is that in the case of the former, one's opponents are seen as legitimate. And in a competition to control the levers of state power, one is prepared to accept electoral defeat and to return to the campaign trail to fight another day. And the expectation is that your opponents will do that. Okay? In the case of the pathological, your opponents become enemies. And once that thinking takes hold, as Edward Shultz said long ago, that society is at risk of civil war. Compounding the complexities at the discursive level, and this is not something that really is taken up in Jeff's book, by the way, but this is something that people like Nelson and Carlo have helped us understand. There are other non-democratic or anti-democratic competing codes, and I won't go into all of them, but we've done a number of studies, this project that has looked at anti-democratic, anti-civil codes in Mexico, in Colombia, and in China, in our project on East Asia. I want to turn my attention to institutions. Specifically, I want to point to the way that authoritarians in the making seek to undermine an existing democracy by transforming institutions. I do so by looking at the specific institutions identified in the book, beginning with communicative institutions. And I'll concentrate on the US, because it's the country that I know best. In the chapter on communicative institutions, Alexander looks at public opinion, the mass media, polling, and civil associations. And by the way, just one of the distinctions with much civil society theorizing is it's only those voluntary associations that are central to a lot of that thinking. Public opinion is often misunderstood as a composite of private, subjective individual opinions rather than a social fact in its own right. Alexander repeatedly uses the following message to convey the idea of public opinion as a social fact. It is, he says, the sea within which we swim, the structure that gives us the feeling of democratic life. In a democratic society with a relatively robust civil society, public opinion maintains a considerable degree of autonomy. This was evident in the wake of the Supreme Court decision to end abortion rights in the United States 2 years ago. This is the first time in American history that rights were taken away from citizens. While this decision was the culmination of a half-century attempt to do so, those who had fought for this result found it to be a rather Pyrrhic victory when they discovered that a substantial majority of Americans support abortion rights, and thus the decision has been read as an affront to the will of the people. There's a debate about whether polling actually captures public opinion, and this has been reflected in thinking by a lot of people, Frankfurt School people, Herbert Blumer, Pierre Bourdieu. But nonetheless, as an American sociologist, Andrew Perrin, said, most Americans think with polls. You know, so politicians on all sides have to work to shape polling, and it becomes part of the task at hand. For authoritarians, control of the mass media is crucial. Let's state the obvious. Authoritarians despise a free and independent media. What they want is a media megaphone, and what they want to suppress is media seeking to hold political leaders accountable. In weaker democracies, as Hungary proved to be, this could be the result of the virtual destruction of an independent and opposition media. In the US, this is not an option for Trump and MAGA. They can vilify such legacy media as the New York Times and the Washington Post, but attempting to shut them down is beyond their ability. However, they can nurture and privilege counter-media operations, including right-wing talk radio, Fox News, and even further right-wing operations such as OAN and Newsmax. Rather than competing with the professional journalism of the so-called lamestream media, they function as ideological operations that often work hand in hand with campaigns and political operatives. The Trump political operation and its sympathizers have been particularly keen on using social media. He just joined TikTok, I heard today. Given that even the minimal journalistic standards of the right-wing television operations might be seen as too constricting if the goal is to intensify polarization and sow confusion. Steve Bannon, who aspires to be the chief intellectual architect of a unified global right-wing authoritarianism, has said that the task at hand is twofold. First, it must mobilize the faithful with messaging that is intentionally polarizing, enacting the Schmittian friend-enemy dichotomy. The goal is to pump fear and anger into the Trump base. Meanwhile, since the true believers are only a minority of the electorate, it is also necessary to address that large slice of the population that is to a large extent disengaged from politics and not particularly informed about the issues at stake. For this audience, right-wing media is tasked with sowing confusion and doubt. In Steve Bannon's words, the task is flooding the zone with shit. Okay? Finally, though this topic is not explicitly addressed in the civil sphere, in order to educate a cadre of right-wing loyalists, think tanks modeled after their Democratic counterparts are vital. This is the training ground for the future. So for example, two key institutions, the Claremont Institution and the Heritage Foundation, once sort of neoconservative bastions, now thoroughly reactionary authoritarian operations. These organizations operate in tandem with right-wing voluntary associations, and I'll just cite one as an example, and that's an organization you may or may not have heard of called Moms for Liberty, okay? With a folksy name and always invoking the idea of liberty. That this is always liberty is the key. This extremist organization conceives that its objective is to promote parental rights. What this means in practice is taking aim at their main enemies, which appear to be public school teachers and librarians. Under the aegis of advancing liberty, the group demands censoring books and libraries, in particular those dealing with gender and diversity. Moreover, they have joined forces with those who have sought to rewrite curriculums by offering a sanitized version of history that downplays or ignores fundamental features of American history, such as slavery and its legacy, and the colonization of the nation's indigenous population. If Trump were to be reelected in 2024, his allies would enter office with a clearer sense of how to promote an authoritarian agenda. Yet it is in the arena of public opinion that it has the least amount of control, since there are countervailing efforts from the left and the center to shape public sentiment about any number of issues. There may be efforts to attack its media opponents, and thus further cuts to funding for public radio and television would be on the agenda, I'm certain, and there would likely be an effort to redefine defamation and libel laws to make it easier to sue their enemies. What we should expect as a result is not the shutting down of oppositional media, but rather an intensification of polarization with the dream of recovering some kind of vital center becoming ever more elusive. It's in the realm of regulatory institutions that the most damage would occur. Civil Sphere devotes 2 chapters to these institutions. They include voting, parties, which you heard Jeff talk about this morning, office, which he's going to talk about tomorrow, and the law. In examining these areas, one should expect a variety of anti-democratic initiatives to be undertaken. And in this regard, it's necessary to place Trump in historical perspective. For one thing, as Levitsky and Ziblatt, who wrote the famous book, How Democracies End, but they have a more recent book called The Tyranny of the Minority, what they point to are fundamental features of the American constitutional system that work against democracy, okay? And you can the only one I would cite here is the Electoral College, where in this century, twice a Republican has been elected to the presidency while losing the popular vote. Okay? And so, and that's just one of a host of problematic features of the structure which anti-democrats can exploit. Okay? One of the decisive victories of the civil rights movement was the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This act has been seriously damaged by the Supreme Court rulings, in particular by a decision called Shelby County versus Holder, Holder being the Attorney General during the Obama administration. The effort of the decision was immediate, as jurisdictions with a record of voter restriction no longer had to deal with federal oversight, and thus in various ways they returned to old patterns, the intent being to suppress the vote of those sectors of the electorate deemed to be hostile to their political interests. Add to this the election denialism that has swept the GOP has cast suspicions about the integrity of the vote. Trump, as many of his acolytes, have already given notice that they may not accept the results of the upcoming election this fall. Okay? This is what we're in store for in the United States. In a 2-party system where 3 third-party candidates have always only served to tilt the balance from one majority party to the other, as Robert Kennedy today, the Democrats and Republicans long functioned as a center-left, center-right party, and they were able to do electoral battle while also legislatively working to govern, to govern by compromise, to work to so-called reach across the aisle. Okay. That said, the right-wing shift of the GOP has been underway for some time, well before, Jeff seemed to want to date it in his talk this morning to more recent times, but it's been going on for some decades, and exactly when you want to point to, I would point to one important period, which was when Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House. Because it was at that moment 2 things happened. He began to describe Democrats as enemies, not as opponents, but as enemies. Okay? That's a new language. And the word liberal was seen as a, if Marxist or Maoist didn't work, liberal was supposed to take on the same kind of negative attribute. And the other thing was refusing to compromise. You're going to have purity. So the idea of governing by compromise, working with your opponents, was something that sort of disappears. Now, Levitsky and Ziblatt are not alone in concluding that the GOP is no longer a party committed to democracy. I fully believe that's the case, and it's a very disturbing reality when you think about this. It's now Trump's party, totally Trump's party. His daughter-in-law runs the Republican National Committee. How should we think about the role played by Trump's charismatic cult of personality is unclear. Some think that once he's gone from the stage, the fever will break and the GOP will return to something resembling a normal Democratic Party. But others, and I'm inclined to support this view, think that the damage has been done and that authoritarians housed in the think tanks and other organizations that I mentioned a minute ago, they've been thinking about this they've been thinking about the long term. They've been thinking about their own march through the institutions. And some of you are familiar with the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Now, if people haven't read Jeff Alexander's 700-page book, I'm certain most people aren't going to read the 900-page document that I started to read it the other day, and it's, among other things, much of it is boring, but then you cut to the chase, and then it gets scary, okay? But here's what they argue they're about. The long march of cultural Marxism through our institutions has come to pass. The federal government is a behemoth weaponized against American citizens and conservative values, with freedom and liberty under siege as never before. Our goal is to assemble an army of aligned, vetted, trained, and prepared conservatives to go to work on day one to deconstruct the administrative state. Okay. To accomplish this goal, the new Trump administration would launch an assault on the civil service. That's one of the things that this document calls for, which is the product of good government of the progressive era of Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican from a bygone era. Expertise will be replaced by tests of political loyalty and science, rationality, and administrative know-how will thus be devalued. A test run of this was evident in the Trump administration, which preferred to rely on temporary appointments that did not need congressional approval, thereby giving the executive the ability to pick people along ideological lines and not based on merit. The Heritage Plan calls for increasing the number of political appointees from the current 4,000 to over 50,000. So you see what part of this agenda is about. The goal would be to undermine the efficacy of what Alexander describes as office, and which you'll hear about tomorrow. In a recent article, he pointed to the crucial importance of loyalty to the obligations of office and the efforts by Trump to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And he singles out Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and in the 11th hour, Mike Pence, the 11th and a half hour, 2 minutes to midnight, Mike Pence, as playing, he says heroic roles. I don't know that goes so far, but important roles in resisting the Trump machine's efforts. But of course, there were others who failed their office obligations, many. There have been an arrest of dozens of people involved in fake elector schemes in the battleground states, for example. A new Trump administration would undertake further efforts to undermine a democratic view of office. And this leads to the final regulatory institution, which receives a treatment in a chapter by itself, and that's the law. And I would simply point to a book by, I would point to a book by Jane Mayer called Dark Money, in which she chronicled the role of right-wing billionaires in funding any number of organizations designed to undermine democracy, and in particular, she focuses on the Federalist Society, which has, since its founding during the Reagan administration, sought to transform the judiciary in a rightward direction. That by itself is not necessarily an undemocratic undertaking, okay? But it is clear that the idea of an independent judiciary has been challenged, always with a wink and a nod. The impact of the organization is profound, reflected by the fact that 5 or 6 of the current Supreme Court members are current or former members. I say 5 or 6 because Chief Justice Roberts insists that he was never a member of the Federalist Society, but there's evidence that he served on the steering committee of the DC chapter of the Federalist Society, so go figure. Their efforts to prevent Trump from being held accountable for his role in January 6th is jaw-dropping, evident at the moment in their delaying and obfuscation over deciding if Trump's actions are immune from prosecution, okay? Thus, basically making it very unlikely that a trial will take place before November. Immunity would mean, as Ketanji Brown Jackson, the newest member of the court and a Biden appointee, put it, we would have a monarchy and not a democracy. And Eileen Cannon, who's the federal judge overseeing the Trump documents case in Florida, is also a member of the Federalist Society. And she was appointed to the bench after Trump lost the election. She appears intent on ensuring that this case does not go to trial before November, knowing that if Trump is reelected, he will kill it, and who knows, she will probably be richly rewarded politically. Okay? Which leads to my final point, which is that it is often difficult to know if anti-democratic politicians are motivated by ideology, by a general contempt of democracy. But we have, for example, cases like the Utah Senator Mike Lee, who insists that the United States is not a democracy. This is a trope of some elements of the right wing. It's a republic, not a democracy. Except there can't be this. Yeah, it's a republic, not a democracy. But there, so some people are sort of overtly anti-democracy. Others, however, you assume it's sheer opportunism, right? The anti-Trumpists who have become some of his most fervent supporters, and I'm thinking, for example, of J.D. Vance, who is one of the many people auditioning to become vice president, these opportunists represent a veritable army at the moment. And this leads to one further thing to consider, not addressed in the civil sphere, but rather taken up by Juan Linz long ago. In thinking about how authoritarianism takes hold, he notes that any polity contains not only those loyal to democracy and those who are disloyal. He assumes there are always people who are disloyal, and I agree. There's also a third category, the semi-loyal. Ultimately, he suggests it is where this category lands, where it casts its support, that determines if a society is to be democratic or authoritarian. And this category is, I believe, very real, very potentially dangerous, and far too little understood. Okay? Civil sphere theory captures the reality of a living democracy, appreciating all of its moving parts. In very quick order, I've tried to kind of lay out some of this, and cognizant of the fact that they can only work together when they are sustained by a culture of democracy, depicted by John Dewey in a passage Alexander likes to cite. Democracy, he says, is primarily a mode of associated living, of co-joint communicated experience. In this brief account, I've sought to do something quite simple, which is to indicate that civil sphere theory is a practical theory that can help us Democrats, small d Democrats, comprehend our authoritarian challengers, not simply to understand, but to be able to formulate ways of fighting them. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al profesor Quivisto por su charla y ahora le doy el micrófono a la doctora Alejandra Armesto, quien hará los comentarios.
Gracias, Ligia. Thank you, Nelson, for inviting me. I don't know if I have to thank you or not. No, I'm very grateful, and I feel that at some point I felt that I was an infiltrator, like Modi would say, because I'm a political scientist, and I haven't read Professor Alexander's book on the civil sphere, but like Orban, exactly. But I've read this piece by Professor Quivisto, and I think we have a common ground. Yeah. Not only because we like democracy, but because political scientists are worried about many of the topics that you are addressing in your paper. So thank you, Professor, for this insightful presentation. Well, as you have clearly outlined, democracy is at risk. Democracy is undoubtedly receding. In the past 15, 20 years, instead of new transitions to democracy, what we have been witnessing is democratic backsliding or plain autocratization. Democracies can regress, they can give way to authoritarianism through three paths that you have mentioned: the coup d'etat, military invasion by a non-democratic power, and democratic backsliding, which is the most frequent form, which has been the most frequent form of transition from democracy in the past 2 decades. Some of the cases of democratic backsliding took place or are taking place under the rule of populist authoritarian leaders. Political scientists define populism as personalistic, usually charismatic leadership that is sustained by direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalized connections to a heterogeneous, amorphous, and largely unorganized mass of followers. In Latin America, as in other regions, populism is now the most serious threat to liberal democracy. But why is populism a threat to democracy? From the point of view of political science, populism stands in tension with liberal democracy, with pluralism, because of its defining features: the personalistic plebiscitarian leadership, which is anti-institutional, polarizing, and confrontational. And political scientists have warned that these personalistic leaders seek to boost their own autonomy and power, like you have enumerated all these strategies. The political scientists are focusing on a different kind of strategies. They look at how these populist leaders see liberal institutions and checks and balances as obstacles. They try to undermine or suspend the separation of powers. They try to capture independent institutions and suffocate opposition forces. They even try to erode political liberty, skew electoral competition, and in extreme cases, they try to perpetuate in power. All of which leads democracies towards backsliding or even authoritarianism. However, populist rule ends, not always ends in democratic backsliding or in autocratic rule. My colleagues, the political scientists, have asked, under what conditions do populist leaders effectively undermine democracy? First, populists need to win elections, and not all populist leaders do win elections. So the first question that one might pose is, under what conditions do authoritarian leaders or would-be authoritarian leaders reach power? Political scientist Laura Gamboa, a Colombian, has found out that in Latin America, these potential autocrats get elected under certain conditions, such as party system instability, poor economic conditions, and state dysfunction. I think that this is called social power, no? From this framework, most of the people here in this room. That's what I've learned this morning. So now turning to the civil sphere theory, I would like to ask you, Professor, what conditions do you think we can find in the civil sphere theory can explain what kind of societies are prone to elect this kind of leaders?
What kind of is prone
to elect populist leaders?
To be drawn to it, yeah, okay, great.
So, because not all the populist leaders, they want to be populist presidents or populist prime ministers get elected. So what do we need to find in the civil sphere in a society to get these leaders to be elected? And now turning to the second topic, which is the most dramatic, which is the undermining of democracy that is linked to some of these populist leaders. Recent scholarship in political science has pointed out that although some of these populist authoritarian leaders have succeeded at destroying democracy, many others have failed. And in spite of all their efforts in that direction, democratic institutions proved resilient and they are still, and the systems are still democratic. For example, well, not full democracies. I don't think they will.
Right.
But the elections are taking place, and there are certain freedoms, civil freedoms and political freedoms. And this scholarship has found out that these populist leaders can undermine democracy, again, under certain circumstances. Not all succeed at undermining democracy. I'm trying to be a bit optimistic. From a structural perspective, Kurt Weiland, a professor from the University of Texas at Austin, has shown in a very recent book that left-wing populists weaken democracy only when they benefit from a commodity boom, and that right-wing populists undermine democracy when they face and are able to solve very serious crises, like security crisis or economic crisis. I was thinking, well, he works on Bukele, and I was thinking of Duterte this moment. Could be one of these successful populists, because he addressed this security crisis with horrible methods, but he did try to do something about that. What this research finds is that when these populist leaders do not encounter these conditions, their rule does not lead to democratic backsliding. So now, and then there is another optimistic research that has found out that that populist success at undermining democracy depends on the type of strategies that the opposition can display. So the first explanation is a structural approach, and this is one that looks at political actors' agency. And so what she finds out is that when the opposition embraces extra institutional channels like strikes and protests and fail, which is the most likely outcome, they legitimize the opposition, and the autocrats can escalate the repression and accelerate the erosion of democracy. From the point of view of the civil sphere theory, I would like to know what are the features of the civil sphere that can contribute to the erosion of democracy, and what are the features of the civil sphere that can stop these attempts from these populist leaders at curtailing liberties and institutions. So I have a lot of time, no? Okay. So in your account, these populist authoritarian leaders will try to weaken or suppress the free and the opposition media that seeks to hold political leaders accountable. They can also try to turn to friendly right-wing, or I would say also left-wing media outlets. It depends on the ideology of the populist leader. And they foster right-wing or left-wing voluntary associations that favor their authoritarian agenda. And they take advantage of biased political institutions and seek to strengthen these sources of bias. So now the question is, now I want to raise another set of questions about the consequences of authoritarian populist leadership in power for democracy. Knowing that not all authoritarian populist leaders succeed in seriously weakening democracy, what would be the sources of strength of these civil sphere institutions that can counter the attacks of authoritarian populist leaders and prevent the weakening of democracy? When can the harassment of the mass media by these populists lead to the elimination of free and independent press? And when can the free press resist? What sources of strength are in the civil sphere to resist attacks on the free press? Under what conditions do civil organizations contribute to the anti-democratic efforts of populist leaders? And where can we find the sources of strength in the civil sphere to counterbalance these civil organizations that support democratic erosion. In some, just as some of the studies focus on the political sphere, my colleagues, the political scientists, have found the factors that enhance or limit the democratic erosion effects of populist leadership. What are the mechanisms of the civil sphere that allow to combat the anti-democratic attacks of populist leaders?
Muchísimas gracias a la doctora Armesto por sus comentarios y ahora pasaríamos a las respuestas del profesor Tognato y después... No, los dos pueden quedarse ahí. Aquí, Carlo, ven aquí, yo me quedo de este lado. Entonces empezamos primero contigo y después con tu colega.
Ok. Empiezo con los puntos de la profesora Maya. Oh, sorry, English. I will start.
Nos emocionamos.
Yeah, I know, switch on. So, talking about switches. Okay, I will start with my discussants. The reason why I refer to that case of Marshall Salins is not so much because of the content, the taboo and the culture contact, is because of the theoretical question and analytical question that Marshall Salins was responding to, which was at the time, structuralist anthropologists were seeing that there were some culture structures that were permanent and were long-lasting over long periods of time. And so the big analytical question they were facing, and also the theoretical question, how come there is change if these things stay the same up there, right? And so that was more or less the agenda of historical anthropology, to come in and say, okay, structures maintain themselves over long periods, but they can be oriented in different ways along time, and those flex points might happen as a result of a change in functions, right? And so what I was saying there is that to me, the case of Marshall Salins was speaking to what I was interested in, not so much because of the issue of culture encounter, etc., but because he allowed me to think, oh, okay, change might come from a twisting of function. And so far, all the studies we've done in my sense at least, in civil sphere theory, is that we have addressed change as a result of the civil struggle, how actors engage in meaning-making activities and reframe things in different ways that expand or shrink the horizon of civil solidarity. But we haven't, so we have the functions, the elements of the civil sphere haven't changed, right? And so I said, okay, Marshall Salins in that piece is pointing the finger on a potential source of change, the change of function. So what is the big function that is there in the civil sphere? Civil translation. So can civil translation be transformed in terms of its civil function? Its civil function is to reaffirm the civil order, can be twisted around, hijacked, and redirected to the opposite. And that was my years in Colombia. Those 14 years, I was faced with very often with the stories of people who left, the civil life to go to the guerrilla, because they came to a point that they were saying, I cannot bear the hypocrisy of the system, etc. So I'm just off. I'm opting out of the civil play, right? So I was responding to that kind of context, and so I was trying to match all that. And so that allows me to go to your second point. You're saying, okay, with the ontological terms that are people that are trying to broaden the ontology. And so how does all that, you know, we have written in civil sphere theory, or even my paper, can address that? And well, you know, the whole arc of expansion of the horizon of the civil community, from including people of certain races, to including women, to including the members of the LGBT community, those kind of expansions were the product of effective processes of civil translation. And so it's very possible that civil translation can also deliver those expanded ontologies by bestowing civil attributes on nature, on non-human actors, etc. Okay, but it can also happen that you know, there might be people, and so I was trying to bring your point in relation to my paper. That might say, okay, you know, vis-a-vis the double standards on the protection of environment, I'm just no longer playing with this. I'm going to a different structure of feeling that allows me to bring in a different kind of ontology and ethics that is not civil in nature. It can go either ways. It's very possible that it can be done within a civil framework, but it might be done also in other ways. And then the issue of martial silence to me was kind of it had a sort of more personal undertone, because I discovered that piece where he was talking about the change of that taboo, or the function of the taboo, when me, an economist, led to a PhD program in political science at UCLA, entered in winter of 2000 in the course of a person whom I really didn't know. His name was Jeffrey Alexander, who had a reader with a pink cover, and he had one of the readings was this thing of martial silence. I still have the reader, and so when I thought about that, I picked it up, and so I thought it was. I'm not sure whether I really achieved even to put forward the conjecture in a sort of decent manner in the paper, but I thought it was quite peculiar that I sort of recovered that piece of literature that essentially came up in that course, that completely sent me off course or on course in a totally different intellectual trajectory for the rest of my life. So, because of that pink reader and the person who taught it.
Let me, I think, in kind of broad strokes, respond to your comments. If I can divide them into two categories. One is, what were the things that have contributed to democratic decline? And then the other is, what can be, at some level, what can be done, right? And let me take, the first is actually, I suppose, easier, because first of all, we're looking at it reflectively. We're living through this stuff, and we can see it. But I mean, it's not coincidental that the rise of populism, if you start tracing like the social science literature on populism, that it really sort of took off in the 90s, but it coincides with neoliberalism, okay? And so you have growing levels of inequality, okay? And that creates problems for large swaths of populations, and dissatisfaction and anxiety and fear. And more significant, well, not more significant, but related to it, is that the whole notion of, you know, like as Margaret Summers in an article on neoliberalism that talks about romancing the market, vilifying or something the state. The idea that you're going to look at everything through the lens of the market, you know. So in higher education, students are consumers, for example. I mean, and it translates this in every sphere of life. And one of the things that does is it undermines any sense of solidarity. I don't know that we've really talked about solidarity today in the discussions, but solidarity is a fundamental feature of the civil sphere, of the book and of the civil sphere in reality. And so, but I think solidarity has been undermined. And, so people's inability to see fellow citizens as, at some level, being equals at the point, in societies that are always inevitably unequal in various ways, the ideal of, but as a citizen, where we all get to cast one ballot and where we get to participate in the political process should we choose and so on, that has been eroded. And if you look at, for example, the Democracy Index, the Economist's Democracy Index, there are 6 categories, and one of them is participation. Another one is sort of governance. Can governments deliver? And those are if you just look at those scores, you can oftentimes find that the countries that have fallen, like the United States, into the flawed, it's certain categories have, you've seen the erosion in certain places. So the idea that government can't deliver, now in the United States, there has always been this sort of suspicion of government kind of a mentality. You don't trust politicians. They're all thieves. And I know this is not just the United States, but this, and so politicians are sort of up against this stuff. These are some of the things I would say in some places, as a result of these economic changes, where you have crime being, an everyday fearful reality, all of a sudden people's commitment to, even at some minimal level, to rights kind of goes out the window. They want to be able to close their doors at night and feel they're secure, or walk out on the streets and feel they're secure. And so they'll allow populist politicians, authoritarians to run roughshod over rights, individual rights. Okay, it's also the case that corruption is a problem. Now, one of the interesting things about populism is that corruption fairly quickly seeps into them. I mean, Orban's government is thoroughly corrupt. Okay, Modi's government is thoroughly corrupt. Okay, so that can sour people on them when they are seen as no better than the people that they replaced. That can be a problem. Now, and I would point out that in addition to things like crime and corruption, the idea that your life chances, the ability to, for people to flourish, for their children to flourish, and to be able to, in the United States, it's like very, very difficult. There was, I think, an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day. How do 40-year-old Celsos of the world, how do they buy a house? Mom and dad. You become dependent on your parents, even if you have jobs and so on, because the cost of housing in many places in the country has so exceeded the incomes that people are getting that the fundamental features of buying a home and kind of settling down into some kind of stable life, and then the so-called deaths of despair, the epidemic of death by alcohol, drugs, or suicide, just overt suicide. That's a reflection of something going very, very wrong with the society. The other side of this, what can be done? I mean, one of the things that, talking about my paper, I was talking about what authoritarians are doing, what their project is, and what the playbook is. And the playbook can be, my point was simply that the playbook can be understood pretty clearly through the lens of civil sphere theory. But the reality is there's a counter to this. I mean, there was after Trump was elected in 2006, I hadn't taken part in a demonstration. I mean, I'm a child of the 60s, so I went to a hotbed of political activity at the University of Michigan, so I know something about being in the streets and so on, being on the receiving end of tear gas. But it was the first time in decades that I had been involved in street protests, and I wasn't alone. A lot lot of my gray-haired friends were out with young people, you know, and it was, and so there was a vast mobilization to resist, and the power and the tools are there, and because you still have a media that's open, you have an ability to try to get your position out there too, right, and to convince people, and so it's a political battle, how it plays out, and one of the ways in which this has to happen is by finding new vehicles for invigorating a broader sense of solidarity once again with people. I'll just give you one example. This happened in a lot of places in the country. It was big in the Midwest. The Moms for Liberty, you know, they're trying to take over local school boards. It happens at the very local level. And my son and daughter-in-law live in suburban Indianapolis, and it was playing out in their affluent suburb, no less. People fought back, you know, and almost in every instance when people mobilized to fight these people, they won. They lost a few, but this was nationwide. You know, so the ability, you know, ultimately, my view is about populism, and I have a view that's, if you read the book that co-edited with Jeff, he has a chapter on populism, and Giuseppe Shortino and I have a chapter, and we have a slightly different take insofar as we tend to argue that populism is inherently undemocratic. I mean, that it's, you know, and I insist, in fact, I insist in that article, Bernie Sanders is not a populist. You know, one of the media things is he's a populist. No, he's not. He's a you know, modern heir of the New Deal is what he is. You know, he's a welfare state Democrat who plays by the rules and who isn't vulgar, doesn't use bad manners. You know, that's like Duterte. You know, and if that's the that's the characteristic of populists. You know, you don't fight them. I mean, Salso's paper was quite good about the problems for the media. Yes, nailing it. Yeah. But the flip side is you have to at some level respond. You can't allow them to. You know, you have to find a different way of communicating your dissent, I guess. But the point is, there's powerful opposition forces, and I do believe that true authoritarians, people who really want authoritarian government, and you know, look at the old literature. All of a sudden, people started reading after 2016. They started pulling out their Adorno et al. Authoritarian personality and reading stuff. And my sense, and I've talked to people who really do work on this, maybe 25% of populations are authoritarian. But those authoritarians can be channeled institutionally. That's what labor unions once did to working class authoritarianism in the United States. It channeled them in democratic ways. And that's what we have to find ways of channeling. Assume the authoritarians are going to always be there, but channel them. Don't empower them. Okay. All right, I'll stop.
Thank you. Muchas gracias a... ¿Se oye, Humberto? Sí. Muchas gracias a ambos por sus respuestas. Y ahora quisiera preguntar si hay alguien que nos esté viendo en línea o aquí en la sala, si tiene algo que decir. Nelson, por favor.
Well, when I read the Civil Sphere book, I realized, or I was excited about the positive view of the theory of civil sphere. There is some struggles, but it's also solidarity and expansion of and inclusion in some way. And now, in all these papers, also Peter, Carlo, Jeff, I hear some tone about this dark side of civil sphere. And this idea of hope and solidarity and communality and inclusion, I think that disappear in some way in your papers. And as you say in your intervention, Peter, about civil sphere in some ways a tool to understand not only autocrats and populism, but also it's a tool to deploy solidarity and democracy. I wonder, how is that possible in this moment? No, sorry for my mood, because we have elections yesterday. Now, how is possible to construct not only an analytical point of view of authoritarian autocrats and people to say no more to civil discourse, and try to recover this spirit of civil sphere theory in that book of Jeff about how to expand solidarity? No, that's my comment for Carlo, Peter, Celso, and Jeff. Just try to understand how it's possible to not only to understand society in this moment, so try to understand new paths to recover in some way the democratic institutions. That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
One question mark.
Okay.
So I have a question about, well, for both Professor Carlo and Professor Peter. So the code of democracy is still being strong and is still expressing the symbolic disputes on cultural and democratic life. And it has a specific temporality, like defending the present and the achievements of the past, maintaining the present because of the past. To a great extent, it's a different code from the past century if we think revolution as the strongest code or one of the central code, the necessity of transformation, not the maintaining. Currently, my question is how the civil sphere as a theory can respond to the spirit of transformation that exists in a lot of societies when it seems in many contexts that the maintaining of democratic values throughout the time can transform these democratic values into a kind of conservative ideology.
Okay. So, first, Nelson, I think that the reason why I wanted to look at the possibility that there might be a switch on, switch off button in the civil translation and its civil function is that we cannot protect the civil order unless we know that there is an off switch. Okay, so if we want to preserve the civil play, we have to recognize there might be people that might get to the point of saying, I'm not playing this anymore, and find a way to meet them. All right. And so, again, they might say, I'm not playing this anymore. They might say it only for a day, and then they go back. And then, or only for some people. But the thing is that the civil order can be degraded as a result of the 1,000 paper cuts that in everyday interactions, people might inflict to it as a result of switching off the button of civil translation. So, you know, the thing is that I guess that like in that paper by Jeff on what is theory, the way you defend agency is by recognizing that there are structural constraints, not by thinking that they don't exist. And the same thing, the way you defend the civil order, by recognizing that people might get to the point of being saturated and might not want to know about it anymore and play at it. Okay, and so the issue of you know, the democracy being past-oriented and having a conservative like taste or flavor, whereas the revolution is forward-oriented. I mean, the history of the civil sphere has been a history of the progressive realization of rights, right? So, I mean, again, there was that comedian from Mali in Britain Got Talent that in his skit said 2 centuries ago this would be a slave auction, right? I don't remember whether. So there has been a process of expanding rights, and that is a hopeful thing. It's future oriented. The issue for me is how do you maintain hope and patience along the path of realization of those rights? And that is why, for me, hope has to do with recognizing the performative conditions under which people decide to switch off the civil translation, decide to switch off the function of civil play. Because if we do not understand the nitty-gritty performative circumstances under which we keep the switch on, then we might constrain the path of hope. So that's where I was coming from.
Wouldn't it be desirable to work on the double standards? Because that's the trigger, that's one of the triggers. There are double standards, and then in face of those double standards, some people choose to exit the civil sphere. That's one piece of the argument.
Yeah.
So what can we do about the double standards?
Well, the issue, what I was saying in the paper when I was referring to the literature on political hypocrisy, is that one of the problems in divided society is that it is very difficult to make a charge of double standard stick. That the part that is being accused of double standard will not admit it, right? And so everyone stands on its own position. So my point is that if it is useless, it apparently is useless to accuse you of double standards, and you just wash it off, and then so why do people on the ground keep accusing if it is useless? And so that's what was why I was saying, okay, maybe it's the Michelle Obama's thing. It's like a ritualized form of keeping my commitments. Even if that guy decides to exit the civil play, I will stick to him till the very end. But the thing that happens doesn't legitimize us to write off the possibility that there might be people who might say, you know what? I am, like Trump says, I'm tired to be the sucker, right? Yeah. And so I'm not playing at this anymore. And so if we try to explore to your question, how do we try to make that levying of the charge of double standard have some performative effect? I think in order to answer that, we should perhaps study systematically the performance of that switch on, switch off mechanism, and looking at the civil sphere at the edge, where you are on the edge of falling into the abyss of non-civil play. Okay? If we learn more of how people manage to get anchored, maybe because like Jeff was talking about group dynamics or whatever, institutional or social networks or something that keeps you playing, then we might get a few lights about what can give us reason to hope and give us time to think that there is a future in which we might realize those promises of the civil sphere.
Let me just make one of the difficulties here. I was thinking of this, framing it a different way in terms of, there are people who would, sorry, is this on? There are people who would, I think, deny that there's a double standard going on, because I was thinking of this in terms of Irving Goffman's book, Stigma, where he talks about 3 kinds of stigma. One of them he calls them, it's a stigma of tribe. so race and ethnicity, right? And one of the things he said about people who are stigmatized, whatever category, I remember when I first read that book many years ago, he said, I think he's doing this ironically, he talks about we normals look at these people. Okay, but he says, we normals don't see stigmatized people as being fully, truly human. And I thought, that can't, that was both a frightening notion to me, and I thought, at first I thought, I really don't believe it. I do believe it, okay? I do believe it now. And so it's one thing to say that the patriots who with their shaman that you had a picture of there, they're not stigmatized, they're us. They're we normals, scary we normal, they're we normals. Whereas blacks, or take another, because we haven't talked about immigration, but immigration always plays a role in every one of these instances. And they are the other two, they're stigmatized. And the idea that, well, and you hear it, there's a ratcheting up of this kind of stuff with Trump these days about, vermin and polluting our blood and so on and so forth. So one of the things about how do you overcome that? It's a big challenge, but it's not like impossible, because, for example, some of this is this battle of history, right? Isn't it? It's like how you rewrite history. And so one is the idea that there was once this is what the right would argue, there was this once homogeneous American past, white, civilized people, right? And then, but in fact, there's another narrative. It's a counter narrative that has been bumped aside, but it was from the 60s on, it was a powerful one, which was, we are this nation of immigrants. Our diversity is our strength, et cetera, et cetera. And based on public opinion polling, look at Pew, for example, most people still say that they believe that diversity enhances America. Well, you have to work that. You have to work that in the discourse, right? And that's what the challenge is, to get a hold of that, and don't let this is the vermin, polluting our blood and so on, win out in the discursive battles. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Since I was implicated in Nelson's question, I think I should respond to it. Reflecting on our discussion, and the last question is a very good one, right? In a time when a populism of both right and left seems more future-looking, what advantages does a perspective like civil sphere theory present? And I think both of your papers provide an insight, particularly that maybe this is a quality of postmodern individuals, that people are very self-aware about what it is they're doing, and they read theory. The right wing in America has very clearly read Gramsci, or what they think Gramsci is. Right?
That's true.
Rush Limbaugh, the right-wing pundit who died a few years ago, started one of his books by saying, there is an Italian Marxist theorist named Antonio Gramsci, and he says this, and this about marching through the institutions, and look, the left has done this. And so, in a way, like, we can imagine theories of civil society that really are theories of politics, like Gramsci, right? And that they offer a counter strategy that basically you take on the strategies of your opponents. Mm-hmm. But there's no solution, I think, in this both of these forms of the Gramscian version of civil society. You lay the groundwork for a direct assault on the state, where you take power. That's a very different kind of argument from a civil sphere theory, where if we have self-aware people who recognize that they could also be caught in hypocrisy, that might make them think, I shouldn't be a hypocrite. And so the question Carlo's asking is, why is it some people decide that, oh, I don't care about people calling me hypocrites, right? But it's a different kind of question where, one possibility is that people choose to exit. It's very well put, right, as opposed to voice, right, in this way. And I think the pitfall, perhaps, of civil sphere theory is that in a context where politics is very hot, it's very boring and lame and not cool to be advocating for institutional, stability, and to say, You know, maybe there's something about good governance. It seems very uncool to say, oh, we need a good bureaucrat who does their work, all this sort of stuff. But one of the characteristics of the Obama era was that you had all these television shows about low-level bureaucrats in the United States enjoying their work, like Parks and Recreation. I mean, there's there's a quality to thinking about how ultimately sort of we think about that person as being very lame and very boring, but also very funny. Yeah. That they truly believe in democracy, and they're also entertaining. And I think that's the quality. If I think I'm right with my paper, that there's a real drama to argument and to arguing with populists and then getting heated and watching whether or not someone can pull off something amazing in their arguments, right? And there's something very different about watching a boring person like Joe Biden administer a government and not attract any attention. And it's there's a negative quality to it. We don't know what he does, and there's a quality with American voters where they don't comprehend the work that he's done, but he explicitly tries to stay out of this kind of argument, and it's a different kind of governance. And so I guess that's my answer, is that in some sense, there's a way in which civil sphere theory suggests ways to lower the heat, but that's not it's not aesthetically satisfying in some sense, but I don't think that should be a deterrent to trying to do something in this context. So that's what I think my answer might be.
People are worried.
Jeff, do you want to say?
Want to add up something? We are here.
Yeah, I would, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, Nelson, I'm not sure that these papers are really pessimistic. I mean, obviously, many of our countries are suffering, are in danger. You know, there's a challenge that we're facing, and the effort is, how will civil sphere theory, let's say, advance in an effort to explain these things better? You know, I mean, this is, I think, what we're faced with. So if you look at my work since 2018, starting with the notion of frontlash and backlash, going on to office, going on to law, it's an attempt to kind of build out some parts of the theory in relationship to the crisis of Trumpism and to the crises of populism. You know, I mean, I think that my colleagues' papers are maybe, well, like Carlo, I've corresponded with him and my other colleagues about their papers, and I feel that there is no real way to have a test as to sincerity. That I think what he's identified, though, is something that would be useful for civil sphere theory, which is to identify a set of kind of pragmatic cultural forms of argument that are used by both sides against each other. For example, the notion of a double standard. I think what's difficult is that most of us are on the left, more or less, and we're committed to expanding the civil sphere, and we're proud of the incorporative movements. And we understand that the more efforts to narrow the civil sphere into more primordial definitions of solidarity have elements in them of Nazism and extreme right-wing movements. At the same time, and we experienced that in the incredible backlash against immigration Black Lives Matter and things. But at the same time, I think we have to step back far enough to realize that the civil sphere will go out, will expand, and will contract. That's the dynamics of social change. And that hopefully it won't go back to where it was before. And I think that looking at what's fragile in our understandings today is positive. Now, my view finally is that populism, and then so Peter and I disagree with this, but I want to defend populism as having lots of good parts. Let's say there's a civil populism and a more extreme anti-civil populism. And that the reason I want to do that is because we're always looking in the societies we live in. For example, when I look at AMLO in Mexico, I see, on the one hand, he's equivocal about a lot of democratic mechanisms, so there's a big danger that he could, really undermine the relation of the civil sphere to democracy. At the same time, clearly the guy has expanded the civil sphere in Mexico in terms especially of economic elements, raised minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so I think right now is probably the most pessimistic period, at least Western societies, but maybe world society has been in since 1940.
30s.
Since since the beginning of World War II, this is a very, very difficult time. So it's kind of a scary time as well. But I think civil sphere theory is compared to most, it has a buoyancy to it because precisely of its illumination of the detailed nature of the discourse of democracy, which is, in my view, much more interesting than the institutional focus of political science. When you read political scientists about democracy, one comes away with no feeling of what speaking in a democratic society or living in one actually is like. We get more of these kind of variable experiments about narrowing and broadening. Anyway, yeah, this has been a really great first day, so thanks very much.
Thank you all. ¿Quieres decir algo? Muchas gracias a todas y a todos por su presencia.